Yeah. Yeah.
As long as sitting down, and that way we'll start training all of the where you are.
Hey, Ryan. Hello, everyone.
Hi, I'm Julie.
Really, hi. Nice to meet you in person.
Welcome. So this is our setup.
Excellent.
And, I've just started the Zoom and some recording.
To address ranging from farm viability and farmland access to food justice and security to worker protections to public and we do our work in three primary ways. We develop tools and legal resources that empower our community partners to navigate. We provide policy support to food system organizations that are engaging in legislative or administrative. And we provide business-related legal services to farmers, food businesses, and related organizations here in Vermont. And our work on payment for ecosystem services is part of a partnership that we formed with two Vermont organizations that you'll also be hearing from today, Rural Vermont and the White River Natural District. We worked together to legislative authority to develop a PES working group and compare that against the working group's efforts over the last few years and make recommendations for future research and analysis once the working group was reauthorized. And so some of you may already be very familiar with this topic, but just to situate all of us at the same starting point, in the agricultural context, PES provides a framework through which farmers can be recognized and fairly compensated, not only for the goods they produce like food and fiber, but also the benefits that result from their stewardship of the land. So reducing soil erosion, preserving wildlife habitat, improving water quality, sequestering carbon. And I say it's a framework because there really is no uniform definition or approach to payment for ecosystem services. And as a policy tool, PES is still fairly young. But the goals of it that a PES program seeks to realize have certainly been around for some time, especially when we think about agriculture. How do we keep land in agriculture? How do we ensure farming remains a viable profession? How do we encourage practices that preserve and enhance natural resources? How do we shift public perception to recognize farmers' roles as land stewards? So PES offers a way to try and answer these questions. And domestically in the US over the last century or so, we've put a significant amount of public dollars toward on-farm conservation practices at the federal level. The Farm Bill, the first Farm Bill, which was enacted in 1933, focused on stabilizing the agricultural economy and addressing its environmental impacts, and established the Soil Conservation Service within the US Department of Agriculture, which is now known as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And today, the conservation title of the Farm Bill accounts for nearly 1/3 of all of the agriculture-focused Farm Bill spending, which amounted to $30 billion over 5 years in the most recent Farm Bill. And much of this spending has gone toward a practice-oriented approach to conservation, so offering cost share payments to farmers to implement specific management practices. And so one feature of a PES program would be to shift away from a payment for practice approach to a payment for outcomes or performance approach, which I'm sure all of our panelists will talk more about. And I would say that timing is certainly right to be thinking about a PES approach and how it can best support the dual goals of farm viability and ecosystem health. At the national level, again, President Biden's climate plan has highlighted the role that farmers in the agricultural sector play in addressing climate change. His plan for rural America proposed that American agriculture be the first in the world to achieve net zero emissions, while also finding new revenue streams for farmers through carbon markets. And Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack has initiated development of a pilot program to provide incentives for carbon sequestration on farm and forest land. So meanwhile, here in Vermont, the state legislature has authorized a payment for ecosystem services and soil health working group to do a lot of the deep thinking and research and develop proposals around financial incentives that would encourage farmers to implement practices that improve soil health, enhance crop resilience, increase carbon storage, and reduce agricultural runoff. Now, states are generally referred to as laboratories of democracy. They have the ability to innovate and try out novel approaches to public policy that may be challenging to initiate at the federal level. And Vermont is a unique laboratory. We're small population-wise, which enables greater access to elected officials and may also allow us to more quickly respond to pressing issues. We're also small geographically, which may allow for more of a systems approach to environmental, agricultural, and other social issues. Just to illustrate, Vermont enacted the nation's first same-sex marriage law. Vermont also enacted the nation's first mandatory GMO labeling law. The GMO labeling law was later preempted, but it did prompt the development of a national GMO labeling requirement, GMO meaning genetically modified organisms. So it's not surprising to see Vermont leading the way here by considering a statewide approach to providing payments for farmers for the ecosystem services that they render. So our panelists are going to talk more about how we got here, what the state is already doing in this area, challenges to developing and implementing program, and the potential that it offers. So first, Patch, who is the Director of Water Quality for the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, who will share some of the state agency perspectives. Then we'll hear from Caroline Gordon, who's the Legislative Director of Rural Vermont. She'll speak about her organization's work in this area and the interests that they're representing. Then we'll turn to Jennifer Byrne, who is the District Manager for the White River Natural Resources Conservation District, which provides ag outreach and education to landowners in Orange and most of Windsor counties. And last but not least, we will hear from John Roberts, who's the Executive Director of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, a farmer advocacy organization made up of around 100 farmer members and nearly 50 agricultural business members. So each panelist is going to offer some context for their organization's work in this area and share thoughts on the development of a PES program. And then, of course, we're going to look to all of you for questions and discussion afterwards. So Ryan, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna take a second here to share a screen, hopefully. How's that look? Great. Thanks, really glad to be here today. Ryan Patch of Vermont Agency of Agriculture. I'm the Deputy Director of Water Quality, not the Director, but that's a minor detail. What I'm going to hope to do this morning is to share a brief history, as I understand it, as to how Vermont has arrived at a very important discussion about the ecosystem and environmental services that agriculture can provide for the state to benefit any number of goals that the state may have. Obviously, my division is focused on water quality, but there's a significant nexus with climate change resilience and mitigation, and need for food security, adaptation and resilience in the face of climate change. So just to contextualize Vermont, 94% of Vermont is covered by natural and working lands, for which 12% is in agriculture, and that's statewide. What I put up on the screen here is 3 separate charts. The top left-hand one here demonstrates the catalyst that really brought agricultural environmental management to the fore in the legislative process that informs the Agency of Agriculture's work in developing water quality programming. And this is a graph that looks at contributions of total phosphorus to the Lake Champlain Basin, which has resulted in eutrophication, algae blooms, and a failure to meet water quality targets for a number of years. The right-hand side of this slide shows the relative contribution. Agriculture was 41% of the contributions leading to Lake Champlain, and is going to be responsible for 59% of the reductions over the 20-year lifespan of the TMDL. So there are contributions, but significant opportunity. By way of background of what the Water Quality Division does at the Agency of Agriculture, we are the regulatory body conducting inspection and enforcement on farms of all sizes throughout the state of Vermont. This inspection and enforcement process is intended to achieve compliance with state water quality standards. And at the same time, we work to provide education and outreach through direct outreach to our staff, as well as funding for partner organizations, as well as direct provision of technical and financial assistance resources to support the cost-effective implementation of conservation practices on farms to work to meet and exceed water quality goals. Since the big law, they call it Vermont's Clean Water Act, was passed, Act 64 in 2015, became effective in July. And since that time, the state has been making significant investments through a permanent clean water fund in water quality cleanup. And from that chart, you'll remember it was not just agriculture that's contributing, all hands on deck to work to address the water quality challenges of the state on agriculture, transportation, developed lands, et cetera. Of the 194 million, about 17 has come to agriculture for the water quality work. And the results are pretty impressive. Given the the investment, the cost effectiveness of these water quality practices are quite pronounced. And since 2016, between 99 and 96% of the total model phosphorus reductions have come through agricultural implementation. And this speaks to not only the willingness of the farmers to engage in programs, their ability to think about how to apply standards to their farm and in ways that participate in programs to meet those goals and to exceed that is really what has in many ways set up this justification on some grounds, but also the need and opportunity that exists in the agricultural sector for, and as I'll get into, not just the water quality goals of the state, but the multiple co-benefits that can be derived from the implementation of conservation practices through programming. As I mentioned, water quality conservation practice implementation, focusing on agricultural croplands and pasture practices through state tracking and reporting has been found to be far and away the most cost-effective per kilogram of total phosphorus reduced annually in the state. This jives with what EPA did in their modeling and setting up the TMDL, and so the validation of that assumption that went into the allocations within the TMDL. Remember that 41% contribution from agriculture and that 59% reduction. A lot of that additional reduction comes from the acknowledgement that the investment in agriculture and agricultural conservation practices is far more cost effective than drawing down the effluent limits from a wastewater treatment facility as an example. So it's interesting to see that this has been borne out. And as was introduced at the top of this panel, the framework for this has been pay for practice. The largest PES program in the country, the Conservation Reserve Program, as an example, is a program that pays for taking land out of agricultural production and putting it into buffers, whether forested or vegetated. And through state and federal partnership, there's significant investments in agricultural conservation practices, not just a program, but we have there on the lower left-hand corner is an example of a before and after of an agricultural crop field and how it just looks better. But there's also benefits for water quality. Obviously, the majority of the water quality practices that have been implemented are cover crop. It's the most we have achieved the most total phosphorus load reductions through cover cropping, about 44% of all load reductions coming from that practice. So this engagement, and I think taking a moment here to say that this implementation is across state and federal programs. It takes a partnership to get there. There's a lot of nonprofits, extension organizations that collaborate as part of an ag water quality partnership, and that the farmers are at the table, not just in developing the proposal that went to the legislature that became Act 64 in 2015, but as we work to develop and build programs, needing to understand what stakeholders need in a program and trying to find the most cost-effective, equitable, and effective way to deliver programs to meet environmental goals of the state. So farmers, in recognizing, well, I think farmers all along have known the power of agriculture to deliver a lot of ecosystem services, But three of the farmer watershed groups in the state, Judge John Roberts is here from Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, put together a proposal that they submitted to the legislature that summarizes this, a proposal to explore how to value agricultural ecosystem services in Vermont, to develop a system which monitors, evaluates, and monetizes ecosystem services provided by agriculture and delivers both environmental and food security to the Vermont community well into the future. And I think that's a very well said, succinct framework that was put into the series of laws that created the Payment for Ecosystem Services Working Group that I'll briefly introduce and then stop talking. But and then I'll talk a little bit about the intersection with the Vermont Climate Council and the Global Warming Solutions Act and how these efforts elevated by the General Assembly, delegated to state agencies, as well as, of course, the stakeholders that are needed to put together this work group, have come together to discuss ecosystem services and how they're provisioned by agriculture. On the left, we have the summary of the members of the working group. Suffice it to say, probably not legible, but the point is there's a lot of people at the table, and that's important. There's a lot of perspectives out there, state, federal partners, extension, researchers, farmers representing many different sectors and sizes, and, as well as, soil scientists, as an example. And kind of breaking into this wheel of ecosystem services on the right-hand side, they're framing up a few different categories of services that can be provided, can be and are provided by agriculture. The work group has really endeavored to identify what are these ecosystem services we want to value, and what is the mechanism to track and account for these changes. And the long story short, it's the soil, right? Soils are incredibly powerful. Not only are they an important media for growing food or crops, but the opportunity that exists for sequestration of carbon in soils, the opportunity for that improved soil health and soil structure, to store water in the soil in times of drought and to produce runoff in times of rain and plenty. It's a really important, it can be underemphasized, in my view, the big ones of the Payment for Ecosystem Services, well, it's the Payment for Ecosystem Services and Soil Health Working Group, so it's in the title, but it's necessary that, or that is in my view, the framework that the working group is exploring is how to identify, quantify, and value soil health and ecosystem services they can deliver. One of the prompts was, what does the Agency of Agriculture do in this space? And this paper practice that I introduced, all of the phosphorus reductions that come from tracking practices, there's also in the working group an emphasis on performance and setting performance standards and providing a mechanism for compensation when those baseline values are exceeded or you demonstrate additionality. Right, as I said, we have in Vermont a agronomic source pollution control program which sets minimum standards for which we provide technical and financial assistance to meet those standards, but there also is opportunity for farms to do more. And so this additionality question is one that's a part of the, well, it's part of every PES program, but it's especially explicit in Vermont, where we have minimum standards that need to be achieved and maintained by agricultural operators. This paper phosphorus program is a USDA funded project. The agency of Ag applied for $7 million over 5 years, and this is to leverage and extend phosphorus reductions from agriculture in Vermont, looking at geospatially explicit modeling and setting baselines and thresholds and additionality for management, and taking a look at the whole farm, not just counting those individual practices, but looking across the whole farm and all of the suites of management that can be applied and quantifying those benefits. Last two slides, one trying to frame the opportunity as it relates to agriculture and the National Working Lands Conservation. This is from the Nature Conservancy Canada. They set out with 19 other research organizations in Canada to explore the opportunity for mitigation opportunities across the landscape. And agriculture and agricultural property management came out as the largest single opportunity and the most potential reductions at the lowest price point. And they said up front, we were surprised to find this. But as I try to show on this slide is there's a lot of overlapping benefits that can be quantified. Just trying to put an example here on the left-hand side is just some generic, probably HCL field that is managed in a way that has really intensive tillage, doesn't have nutrient management, doesn't have field-specific conservation practices applied, but for which we see a lot of environmental challenges. On the right-hand side is a no-till cover crop field in Vermont that looks really nice on a November day. And within that management, we see a number of stack practices that can be applied by farmers. And what we have in those two categories are the reductions in benefits that can be quantified through the application of those practices, right? And the key reduction benefits come from DECs, tracking and accounting, and the CO2 equivalents of both sequestration and emission reductions from the management of those soils is for Addison County from the Comet Planner. And so when you look at the soil and the way that farmers can manage it, there are a lot of benefits that can be quantified, and this doesn't get at the no less important but more difficult to quantify value, the adaptation and resilience benefits in the face of a changing climate. So there's our PES website where it tracks the working group, and the meetings are recorded and posted, as well as other data, and that's the contact info. So hope I didn't ramble too long there, but I appreciate the opportunity to try to frame some of the conversation. Thanks.
Brian. Great, so I think now we'll turn to Caroline, who's going to talk a bit about rural Vermont and share some thoughts on the topic as well.
Sure, thank you so much, Sophia. Yeah, glad to be here. I'm excited for so many students to make all the way here to Montpelier as well. And I see there's a bunch of you joining online as well. I hope the audio is well enough to hear me through the mask. So I'm Caroline Gordon. I'm the legislative director for a small advocacy organization called Rural Vermont. So Rural Vermont is one of the two largest farmer membership-based organizations in the state of Vermont. We work towards a resurgence of community-scale agriculture, and we do that through advocacy, organizing, and education. So as the legislative director, you can imagine I'm more active on the advocacy part. I'm basically a lobbyist, work here next door in the State House, hopefully again in person next session. So while the bill that Ryan had mentioned that constituted the PES working group was written in the State House, I was following that closely with rural Vermont. And one of the first things we did was to advocate that diversified farmers need to have a seat on the working group directly, and successfully did so. It was the policy director of NOFA Vermont, Eddie Kempner, holding that seat for quite some time, just until September, and now the diversified farmer holding that seat. And also another seat, which we thought was important to include, and that was one for the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition. That seat is now held by Kat Buxton, who I saw us joining the call, a farmer and activist, and the Healthy Soils Coalition is a network of activists and farmers in the state of Vermont, kind of a statewide offspring of the National Healthy Soils Coalition, and that is a network that is engaging in policy discussions, but also in really essential discussions on soil health, and providing educational opportunities on the matter to farmers as well as to consumers. So that is just important when a basically democratically instituted body convening that these sort of representations can be part of the group, so that the interests represented by these people inform that decision making in the group. So once constituted, now we're working really closely with those representatives and having insights into the process. We, aside from the working group, met regularly as a stakeholder group for small farmer interests. We call it the small farm group, where we meet in between the working group meetings just to talk about what is happening in this political arena. How does the information shared potentially affect farmers, inviting farmers to get informed about the process, engaging in the conversation, potentially then sharing their thoughts in a public comment with the working group or with a formal proposal. And that's something that Jennifer will talk to when it's her turn, since she has been working with one of the organic farmers on a specific programmatic proposal. But there have been other farmers like Stephen Leslie from Capitol Farm, who's also very active, engaged in climate change dialogues in the state, or any soil health affected conversations in the state, and who always has like a lot of policy ideas. So it's nice to have just a forum where farmers can express their opinion and then eventually have that opinion leveraged to advocacy organizations like ours in that policy realm. And then together with Jen and Maddie Kemner and a couple others, early on, after the first year of the working groups convening, we said, maybe what we need is a network, a policy network where an independent forum of stakeholders can convene and just get an overview of all the different soil health conversations, because as John Roberts would probably highlight a little more, there's not just the PES working group, there's also the Climate Council, and then there's activists who pepper like independent soil health related bills for legislation and such. And there was just a lot going on. It was kind of difficult to keep an overview and to see what can fly, what is timely, what is necessary, and how can we collaborate more and close gaps and build bridges. And so we launched a soil health policy network, and that we might reconvene. There's kind of still in a break from that because there's so much activity on the other forums right now. But for quite some time, there was a monthly meeting across the board where activists, farmers, several policymakers, but also researchers had an opportunity to meet virtually, because it was also difficult during the pandemic to meet at all. Just to to come together and just get each other a little bit of update on what's happening on research, what's happening on policy, and how can we create more connectivity amongst our works. And I think some good things have come from that, and I was happy for organizing that. So now my job is mostly involving to monitor the working group process and to keep our members informed about it. And what we did then, we noticed that in 2019, what the working group did was basically thinking a lot about what they are meant to be and what are their values, their guiding principles, and what are maybe their goals for their work. And we're also receiving a lot of input from a lot of different research corners. And then there were like a few trends noticeable. And Sophia had mentioned some of them. I mean, there's this big desire to believe agriculture as a climate solution and to frame it that way and to incentivize practices and outcomes that can deliver that. And there was net zero as a goal, but also the word carbon markets and the need to sequester carbon. And for Vermont, we work also very closely with our national allies and international allies, La Via Campesina, National Family Farms Coalition, and the few other existing PES programs that have been rolled out. Some of them are being seen by farmer interest groups as really negative role models, so-called false solutions. Most of them that are based on creating carbon markets, because oftentimes these administrative systems that create a carbon market, most of the money goes into that administration and implementation, but the revenue that can be achieved for a farmer on a farm basis is oftentimes not enough of an incentive, especially not for small farmers to even subscribe to the program because it's very complex to enroll. And then if they enroll, the revenue on an acre basis is too little to have actually a transformative incentive character. So that's why one of the things in my role that was always important is to flag that as a non-desire for us here in Vermont to go into farm markets. I think it's definitely unstoppable that it's happening because it's simply private organizations that do it regardless, but it's nothing we have to do in a state program. And we only talk here about creating a statewide program because it's a state instituted working group, and we'll be recommending in the end state legislation. So in the finite product, hopefully it will be the state legislature passing a state program. So carbon markets is something that private investors can organize independently from that, and they are. So what else do I want to say in the time I have? The work then, you know, given that there's such an interest in advancing existing programming to like, I think I would frame it as being just up to speed with technological innovation. And just having the means to measure outcomes, potentially, even though many of these tools are like still in the, like being developed in pilot stage, like, and it's like also there, like, I think it's great for any program. It will be a win-win because it would be most cost effective. And, you know, if you were to only incentivize something that has been delivering a measurable outcome, and you only pay for the actual effect you have been achieved with your conservation practice. So I'm talking about why is it so important for potentially to like develop a program that is focusing on outcomes. Because it's of course great for the program if you can actually, and also for the farmer, you can actually see, hey, I've been enhancing my soil in that way. And it's not an unknown what the actual effects were. But unfortunately, yeah, many tools are not really available on a farm-to-farm basis in a way that maybe the administrative and implementation costs will again make that a feasible pathway. So also there we are watching carefully of what the trends are, because I think what the working group has said early on is ideally what the work desires PES is to facilitate a paradigm shift of not just addressing resource concerns, but incentivizing regenerative practices. And through that, I think the vision statement from the Watershed Alliance have made that clear. Through that, compensating ecosystem services generate farm viability. And that is something, I mean, that is also for, you know, all these regenerative farmers, organic farmers that have been really outsourcing themselves since the 70s to do good land stewardship. It's also a desire to achieve that farm viability, because oftentimes current incentives do not reward good practice. They are only incentives for addressing resource concerns. And oftentimes the farmers who are doing good land stewardship and building ecosystem services don't have a resource concern. So for rural Vermont, it's important in this program to marry everything under one umbrella and to achieve both, address resource concerns by also rewarding ecosystem service and good land stewardship and creating farm viability for all farmers. And so the legislative charters do something really important, I find. They kind of charge the working group to look at existing programs and to look at existing financial incentives and to see where's gaps, why do they work, why do they not work? for this goal. And then to think about, can they be amended to achieve that goal? Or do we actually need a new program? I think that from a farm stakeholder perspective is an important approach because it charges the working group to think about what is already the regulatory burden on farmers and why do programs currently work and not work for the ones, also for the ones we want to reward. And then think about how can we, what changes can we do most easily to get to our goal? And that is on the ground important so that farmers don't have to decide either to go into the patchwork of all existing programs and continue going by that way, or when we actually develop a super complex new program to only go with that and then lose the current subsidies they already have potentially because it might be too much to do it all because there's only so much also a farmer wants to go to programs, applications and grant applications. And then from the legislative side, there was an auditor's report that I always mention in conversation that was just issued this May that show that within the last decade in dairy in Vermont alone, there were over 285 million spent. And that is a subsidy spent through all the different kinds of incentives, whether that's tax credits, grants, or other programs. I think also policymakers will just very carefully weigh the options and weigh what money is going into dairy, but also into the in fact as a whole before they look at ways and means and appropriations for any additional programs. So it's kind of just a matter of good business to look at what we already have, what do we want, how can we change what we have to get what we want, and then look at what do we actually still need. And so together with the Center for Ag and Food Systems and the Conservation District of the White River Conservation District, we've been looking at these legislative charges, and after the first term of the working group, we said, okay, where are you now in that work? What have you already done along this way to satisfy these charges? And can we already see if there's a pathway here in this assessment of existing programs and financial incentives? And there was little to no work on that front done yet, and that work had then, there was a long gap in the start of the pandemic, and the working group reconvened early this year. And early on, we were able to submit our report and flag the importance of that work. And sure enough, they did pick that up and looked at existing financial incentives. And now, time?
Yeah, so we want to make sure there's enough time.
Yeah,
for
thanks.
questions from
Yeah,
the
I don't have a time.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. And I'm wrapping it up. That's something Jen will talk about more because her group has been working on a programmatic proposal that will fill right into that gap and basically do a twist to existing programming. And then just a final word, another thing that's always important to us is to encourage the working group to seek direct farmer input as a guidance into the work. So we want to see farmer surveys on any programmatic proposal so that not just the farmer groups that have launched the work, but all farmers in the state have the opportunity to give feedback on what is the direction this potentially paradigm shifting programmatic advancements in the state can take. And we'll go through that.
Jennifer, go for it, Jennifer.
Great, I can pick up right where Caroline left off. So my name's Jennifer Byrne. I'm the district manager of the White River Natural Resource Conservation District. I'll introduce the district in a minute, but since Caroline was just referring to them, I wanted to put up here the legislative charges to the PES working group. And you can see, number one is identify agricultural standards or practices that farmers can implement that improve ecosystems. And then number two is recommend existing financial incentives available to farmers that could be modified or amended to incentivize implementation of the agricultural standards identified under number one. So that's sort of where my focus is probably throughout this proposal. And then I'll show you what we're suggesting sort of for number 3, which, to answer the if existing financial incentives are inadequate, then propose a new program or a new incentive structure. So yeah, we definitely want to, look at where we are in order to shape where we're going. And really our focus has been throughout our advocacy is making sure, farmer voices are at the table, and folks who are sort of in the field, on the ground, working with these programs are represented and heard throughout this process and consulted throughout this process. So just a little background, because I think a lot of these are students, and then I think I've presented this to the Healthy Soils Coalition before, so some of you may know what I'm about to speak on. But really briefly, actually, before I do this slide, I'd like to show you when we are talking about conservation programs through the federal government, we're typically talking about EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, which are both administered through the USDA NRCS. So these are working lands programs, which are, funding for active production lands, which are in active production, to implement practices. So the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service is a division of the federal government, and they implement all of these conservation programs through the Farm Bill. And so we'll touch a little bit on, what that is, what EQIP is, what CSP is, but I do want to talk also about what a conservation district is, because we are not the federal government. We're not really the state government. We're a subdivision of state government. And so we actually are a really interesting little unit that was developed back in the 40s. The NRCS kind of came to be out of the Dust Bowl, and the conservation districts were established. USDA employees, they were looking for ways to extend conservation assistance out across the United States. And they believed that here the solution was to establish democratically organized soil conservation districts to leave the conservation planning effort at the local level. So we are democratically organized. That is, we have a board of elected officials. There are 14 conservation districts throughout the state of Vermont. I'm not sure what all I have here. So there are 3,000 conservation districts across the United States, with 17,000 individuals serving on district boards. And, our goal and our purpose is to promote healthy soils and water and forests and wildlife, and to coordinate assistance. Because of our sort of unique structure, we are able to take federal funds, state funds, private funds, and sort of channel the money when necessary, or, be able to let farmers know about all the varying resources that are available to them. So we coordinate assistance. We are really essentially project managers. We run farm management teams where we pull together all the agricultural assistance service providers on a particular farm to sort of make sure that the ball keeps moving forward. Because when you have a conservation plan or a business plan or a farm viability plan, implementing the plan is really the challenge. And there's a whole team of service providers that farmers work with, up to like 20 to 40 sometimes on a particular farm. But there are many, many people working with farmers, and it can be a real burden. It can be really challenging for the farmer to even keep us straight. We think we're helping, but really we're interrupting their day. They have to repeat themselves. They have to explain their operation again. A lot of the times we're young and unexperienced, and, we're not farmers, and they're like, who are these people coming onto our land? So what we're trying to do in Vermont through the conservation districts and a lot of partners, there's a lot of partnership going on right now throughout the state to try to better coordinate ourselves to reduce that burden that we're putting on the farmer just by nature of what we're trying to do. And so here are some different just background information, different names districts go by. There are 14 in the state. and we're overseen by the Natural Resource Conservation Council. I don't think I need to show you the rest of this slide because I'm going to move along. So I do want to touch on the existing programs that we're talking about here when we're talking about federal conservation programs. So I came into this conversation in Vermont about 3 or 4 years ago, and was really so excited that Vermont is talking about this and is really thinking about this. It's a tremendous opportunity to look at what resources we have and seeing, how can we streamline this? How can we structure this to really build the future, not just continue to respond to resource concerns, but actually paying farmers for farming, quote unquote, regeneratively, quote unquote, sustainably, doing things that are good for the ecosystem and are producing actual ecosystem services, benefits, not just fixing problems. I started with the NRCS back in 2011, and it's sort of always sort of in your face when you're dealing with NRCS contracts, where it's like all this money is going to fix these problems, and meanwhile the farmers who are really doing a good job don't have the ability to access the same amount of funding, even though they could really benefit from it from a business standpoint, a viability standpoint. And so what I always used to hear back then was, when I would sort of start complaining about the way the programs were set up, people would say like, oh, well, there is CSP, but it's not funded. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EQIP and CSP just to get a little baseline information of what the differences are. So EQIP is a short-term practice-based contract. It's narrowly focused. It's based on resource concerns. There's a one-time payment after the practice is completed. That's sort of it's the biggest program that NRCS runs, where CSP is a 5-year commitment. It's really looking at the entire operation. It's looking at what are the farmers doing well now already, and pay them for what they're doing well, and then give them a little bit of money to make enhancements on what they're doing. So it comes in the form of annual payments. And then there's an enhanced payment when a certain practice that you're contracted to do is completed. Since the 2018 Farm Bill, CSP has had a ton more money, way more money than it's ever had before, which is very exciting. It's been a successful program out west because it's pretty easy for, a huge crop farmer to say like, oh, I'm doing like cover cropping and no-till on all like these 1,000 acres that I'm farming. And then they get a really nice payment. And it's easy because they have a monoculture that, they don't have a whole diversified system that they have to account for if you're looking at the entire operation for this contract. So now Vermont has more funding. So for CSP, now again, this is the federal government, not the state government. And there's really money on the table at this point. There are farmers that there's more money than there are applicants to CSP in Vermont at this point. And there's many reasons for that, but it is a complex, it takes a lot of time to run these contracts. So, my sort of counterparts at the NRCS, the soil conservationists in the office with me, the amount of time that they have to spend on a CSP application is pretty intense. And so it's not something that they can just, throw all the farmers in Vermont into who are doing a good job. So there are some limitations there. And I guess I'm not sure if I need to go into these things. I have a bunch of different presentations I'm pulling from. So to give you some idea, just because it's interesting, I think, these are the calculations that they're using in order to determine your payment rate under CSP. So A is the number of resource concerns met at the time of application. B is a standard rate that they apply to those resource concerns. And then C is the acres, and D is, the standard rate for each land use. And so the minimum contract is $1,500. Even if you do this calculation and it's less, you will get at a minimum 1,500, but there are contracts that go up to like 40,000. I mean, you can go even higher than that, but it's somewhere around there. And then, the additional activity payment, you can see that these are all calculated, but what it's really based on, at the end of the day, and what everything NRCS does is based on, is conservation planning. So you can't get a NRCS contract without a conservation plan. A conservation plan is a record of farmer decisions and their goals for the future. And so conservation planners, these are certified planners that are exist within NRCS, within the conservation districts and the Association of Conservation Districts. They work one-on-one with a farmer. They balance the ecological, social, and economic effects of these decisions that the farmer is planning for. They look at the natural resources on the farm, the crops they want to plant, how much erosion and runoff they're dealing with, crop rotations, what type of wildlife may be present, what type of wetlands that may be present, or how they can use filter strips in their operation to filter nutrients. And then, of course, manure management. And so conservation plans are, like I said, they are required. However, not every conservation plan is created equal. A lot of the times, NRCS has this 9-step planning process, that the ideal way to kind of access assistance. And it starts with, the beginning stages is these consultations, and then you develop your plan, and then you go in for assistance. But a lot of times it doesn't happen that way, where someone will just Google a grant, or will hear about it and they'll apply. And so the conservation plans can often be written just to fulfill that void, that requirement. And so they're not like a holistic, comprehensive conservation plan. So it's important to think about that when we're trying to design for the future of what is the technical assistance that we want to provide in order to help people through these plans. And what we're trying to stress through our advocacy is that we really need to put a lot of emphasis on planning. Conservation planning, business planning, farm viability planning, succession planning, grazing planning. We, can get really caught up in the conversations about markets and measurement, being able to measure exactly how much phosphorus is running off your field. However, it's really nothing without planning, because farms are a whole system, and there's so many factors. So, for having a usable plan that a farmer can use, and having a team behind you that can help you implement that plan, because a farmer can't just take the plan and make all the changes on his operation. There's a lot of steps. It's a step-by-step process. It really is on the ground. You can't skip steps with farming. So planning is so critical. So that's partly what we are sort of promoting through our this proposal that was developed out of the small farm advocacy group that Caroline mentioned. We built what we're calling CSP Plus, it just to point people towards the resource that CSP is. And what we're really offering is a concept, a framework for moving forward with the PES discussion in order to build upon existing programs and create a program that's simple and accessible for farms of all sizes, that doesn't disproportionately favor large farms in impaired watersheds doing, extractive farming practices. It's emphasizing planning and, influx into technical assistance. And it's equitably values historically underserved and beginning farmers. I'm not sure how much time I have to go through this plan. Is there a time?
I think we can give you another 2-3 minutes. That's okay.
Sure. Okay. So let's see. So yeah, a common discussion so far has been, well, whether to measure outcomes or practices. This program that we're proposing, it will measure both. Outcomes are important measures of particular types of impact, but can be really reductionistic in focus. They'll value one outcome to the exclusion of others. The metrics relating to outcomes are very disputed, and they fail to capture the holistic impacts of practices and particular types of farms. There's also a challenge of determining baselines and factoring in additionality in an outcome-based model. At the same time, practices look different on farms based on management and soil type and microclimate, and it's difficult to monitor how successfully each farm is implementing a practice. And so we want to build off of CSP and specifically the CSP bundles that were created to emphasize holistic planning that will bridge the gap between these approaches and will allow for case-specific, farm-specific, on-the-ground flexibility that's required in all farming systems. So, it builds off of CSP, as I said, and we've identified a few shortfalls that, throughout the process of speaking to farmers and speaking to service providers. And research, and there are more, and there are ways that we believe that a state program could supplement some of these shortfalls. There's a lot more research to be done on that, and we could really build out from, building off of a federal model with a state supplementary program. And this is an example. So this chart was actually created by a farmer, and he proposed this, after listening to the PES working group, just for maybe 2 meetings. And he was like, why don't they just do this? So he sent it to us, and I was like, we could build this into a proposal because it's really similar in a lot of ways. There's an equivalency with CSP. And so we built off of, what he knows as a farmer. And so as you can see here, the first step of the program we're suggesting includes a base rate paid to all participating farmers that meet the required agricultural practices, the RAPs. This would be an annual payment. And by keeping it consistent across all farms, it will actually help benefit smaller farmers, smaller size farms. And as an upfront payment, this can help a farmer cover expenses for initial planning or transitioning costs. If they're transitioning their management style, there's a loss. And based on our farmer Guy, his own experiences, he suggests a base payment of $10,000. He said, he would much rather see $40,000. And participating farms would also receive per acre payments that would reflect their practices. So the first tier steward would pay $10 an acre for implementing basic conservation practices. The soil builder tier pays $60 an acre for practices and outcomes that are a bit more ambitious. And at the regenerative tier, farmers receive $90 an acre for practices and outcome that are more strongly prioritize stewardship of resources. And you can see here, we also are including a completed plan and a comprehensive conservation plan throughout this as you move forward. You can't have the plan up front. It would be exclusive. It's hard to write plan, takes years to even get certified to write plans. So we don't want to require it in order to enter this program. But if you're in the program, you have to be working through the conservation planning process in order to get a comprehensive plan on your farm. And then you can work from there. I mean, there are many, many programs that you could access. You don't have to just access this one. And then, we do want to shepherd those who it makes sense to shepherd them through a CSP application. And then some farms, it might not make sense for them to apply for CSP. But we do picture this as like a supplemental add-on to a CSP contract potentially. And so here you can see how this would play out on a 20-acre farm. The numbers are kind of weird how this is set up, but you can see, there's the base pay, annual base pay, and then or the base payment and then the annual payment throughout the years. And then an example of a 100-acre farm. That's think that's all I want to share on this, unless there's anything else or any questions. I'll turn it over to John.
We'll have questions, but let's save them for you.
All right, John?
I'm not sure I have anything to add. I think, but from a farm point of view, so I'm the executive director of a farmer advocacy group, as mentioned, roughly 100 farmer members. I farmed, I was a farmer for 40 years, dairy farmer. But our membership encompasses some of the largest farms in the state, down to a beekeeper. And we have both conventional and organic members. And our organization, under our president, Brian Kemp, who is the manager of the largest organic beef operation in Vermont, I believe. Brian and our board decided to ally with the other two watershed groups in the state to push the PES program. It was based on our general philosophy for our organization, which is water and environmental quality concerns, and also economic sustainability. And, you know, we started back in 2012, 2013. I was actually one of the founding members at that time. I was still farming. And it was at the time when the state was moving to a much more highly regulated, active environmental approach to agriculture. And we wanted to have a say in that. We wanted to be heard. We wanted, as Jennifer mentioned, recognition for some of the things that farmers do that are not recognized. They're sort of dead. And, you know, things have dramatically changed in the 40, I don't think I saw too much, but for a long time I have farmed in Vermont. And we have a whole different attitude today than we had 40, 50 years ago. I always remember a particular bumper sticker which sort of said, don't criticize farmers with your mouth full, which I personally found rather offensive. And I don't think did farmers any real benefit. You know, today, after the pandemic, we probably got a better focus on what our local farmers are doing for our food supply than we had, many of us had a year and a half ago. So we feel very concerned that we need to transition from this payment for practice basis and move towards much more of a payment for outcome basis. And, you know, I'm going to shift because I've also serve on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council, which is charged with, by December 1st, which is frighteningly close, coming up with a plan to achieve our goals over, you know, between 2030 and 2050, to significantly reduce our greenhouse gases and other environmental impacts that we need to pay attention to. And what is interesting and exciting to me is the PES question and climate mitigation sort of neatly fit together. That things farmers can do to achieve a payment for ecosystem services will also achieve substantially reductions in their carbon use or carbon emissions. And I think this is also true of all sizes and types of farms. Whether you're a small vegetable growing operation to a large dairy operation. And we've significantly made changes in the last 5 to 10 years. We've gone, for example, from roughly 5,000 acres of cover cropping to 45,000 acres of cover cropping, or within that region. And which I hope we will get to a point of almost 100% cover cropping. I would love to be able to drive around the state of Vermont and see no bare ground in the fall or into the winter. And I think farmers are steadily moving in that direction. That has huge impacts on soil health, on organic matter. We actually have, I think, University of Vermont have shown we have some of the highest organic matters in our soils, far higher than the national average, which shows our farmers are doing some great things. Just very quickly, one of the questions we still need to answer is the base at which we're paid from. Every farm is different. It's sort of, to me, one of the exciting things about farming. There are so many different ways to skin the cat, to use that analogy of doing the job of growing. You know, you take a gallon of milk in the store and it can be produced in many ways, from a grazing herd, from a confinement herd, from a TMR herd, you know, and each of them has pluses and minuses to how they do it. So establishing a base for which we can pay, and I believe the University of Vermont is just initiating a research program to do that, to try and figure out where we sit on the soil health spectrum, for example, will enable us to really incentivize and increase farmer participation. And I think with that, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, John. And if we can just do a round of applause to the panelists. Okay, so the question and answer part of this will be starting off with people in the room, because that'll be easier for me to manage, but I look at you all, we're not at the screen. So why don't we open it up for questions? And I know you just received a lot of information, so you know, take your time to think about what your questions could be, but we have a lot of experts here in the room that are looking into these different plans and programs, like the conservation stewardship program, industry services. It's really a lot of interesting things going on. And also, I want to say, I know you guys might feel overwhelmed by all this information, but I think as you move out into farms and start talking to farmers, you're going to start hearing a lot of these terms repeated. So, are there any questions from people?
Sorry, you did talk about a base payment. I guess, but like, what are the ways, if you transition to a payment for outcomes, how do you support farmers as they start implementing programs? Because obviously they plug into the name.
Can you just repeat the question as you?
Is it directed at one of us in particular, or all of you? I mean, I think we're still figuring out some of those issues. I mean, we don't have a PES, you know, plan. I mean, Jennifer talked about a proposal, which, you know, is under discussion, under review. So I think that's sort of one of the conundrums that we have to establish exactly where we're starting from and what we're going to pay for. And of course, one of the biggest ones is where the money's going to come from to do all this. We haven't answered that one yet. We'll probably be having discussions under the Golden Dome about that one. So, you know, I think my feeling is that you know, we're making progress, but we haven't really sat down and really figured out exactly what we're going to pay for. And you know, how do you measure farmer X from farmer Y, particularly if X and Y grow different things, and where they start from and where they're going to go. That's part of this research project that's just started up at UVM. But, you know, that means, you know, they've just started a research project, so it's going to be a year, 2 years before they have results to help us figure that out. So, but, you know, on the climate side, this is the other thing that I think a lot of these projects, improving soil health, increasing organic matter, sequestering carbon, improving grazing. I mean, I won't go on and on, but you know, improving feed management. We all know we're heavily cow-oriented state, mostly dairy cows. We have about 123,000 mature dairy cows in the state, and they're birthing away right now. And how do we manage? To me, one of the beauties is if we can reduce their enteric emissions, as we all politely say, they're burping, it actually makes them more efficient animals. But that's another thing, you know, the sort of that these catchy seaweed is a catchy, you know, media darling right now for feeding cows, but it's only on very limited research, and we need more research. And what else can we do? But we also can't not move forward. We can't sort of twiddle our thumbs and say we need to wait for the research. We need to make progress. That's my take.
I wonder if, to kind of continue on that thought, it might be possible. I know for the first year and a half or so of the working group, it was a lot of information gathering around some of these questions. And part of it was looking to see if there were existing programs or examples the state might be able to look to. I think part of the issue is that there aren't a lot. But I wonder if, I don't know, Ryan, if you have some thoughts based on, you know, working alongside the working group of examples that maybe address that issue of transition payments from moving, you know, while moving from practices to outcomes, or any other existing programs that might be able to help shed some light on that question.
Sure, happy to dig in. I don't know to speak for the respondents or people on the call can talk in this direction. The perspective of the agencies, we need both. Pay for practice is a very efficient and effective set of programs that are working to achieve state water quality goals. We're only 13% of the way there to meeting the phosphorus reduction standards needed by 2038. And so those practices and programs are needed to be invested in to deliver those water quality benefits. However, quantifying the co-benefits for climate, for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and any other ecosystem services you want to put out there, I think is an important step to understand how existing state and federal programs for which the Climate Council put together a comprehensive and shared with the Soil Health Working Group, there are about $28 million per year of state and federal resources that are going towards water quality conservation. And that leverages the significant share of phosphorus reductions. We need a protocol to quantify climate benefits. But a major part of this conversation, and what I heard from the farmers in the legislature, was there's a whole bunch of additional benefits for which our compensation for food and fiber does not reflect the benefit the state of Vermont's getting, and that may require additional revenue to fully value and incent management changes that the state would like to see. So I think it is additive in my perspective, and we have a very strong base and engagement. And so a lot of those pieces are in place, but whether it's climate-based or otherwise, there's other funding that may be needed to achieve those goals on a scale that people want to see for that paradigm shift, right? That transformative unlocking of farmer potential to deliver those natural climate solutions or other ecosystem service benefit that we want that.
So I'm not sure, Jennifer, if you heard the question, but just for one of our students in the audience, Alex, she was asking if there's a time span for the CSP Plus program as far as when it will be implemented. Is that right? Or like more like
I really can't hear, but I heard something about time span for.
I guess my question was, CSP, you mentioned that it has a 5-year commitment in terms of the plan with the program and the farmer. So I was wondering for the CSP Plus program proposal, whether you have an idea of a time span commitment for that, or if it's still in the discussion phase, I guess, but I might have just missed it.
Yeah, it's definitely, still within the discussion. I mean, I think, CSP, you can renew after 5 years. And so we would want this program to be similar where, a farmer can depend on it for multiple years. And yeah. We also discussed, those different levels that we're starting to chart how long quote unquote can or should or will a farmer maybe spend at a certain level. Is a farmer just going to stay at level 1 and maybe that's okay, or as long as they're implementing their conservation plan, they are inevitably going to end up at the next level. It's hard to say. It's a matter of how well the plans are written and how much we help farmers in that process of transitioning into regenerative, sustainable farms.
I think this is a good question to take away. So if anyone has a question, come up.
I think Ryan mentioned that the working group decides or determines which ecosystem services to value. And I was kind of wondering if that determination of which ecosystem service to value is based mostly on ease of application. I feel like COVID-19 services would be one of the most easy ones to value and quantify, whereas something like cultural services would be most difficult. And I think that potential is it's solely based on ease of calculation. What are you reading on? So I just wondering about that for me.
Yeah, that's a great question about the priorities for funding. I will say it's not easy, even the provisioning services to calculate or model or measure. And that's been a large part of the discussion. The 3 areas as I see it that the working group has prioritized in their first report is water quality outcomes, climate change mitigation, and watershed resilience. And that the values of culture, jobs, sustainable development, those are all benefits that aren't being tackled by this group at this time. However, there are certainly benefits that could be derived from that. The watershed modeling is probably the most challenging. How can you measure or model the downstream benefit of improved soil health management and on what time scale? We know on a watershed basis that wetlands and crop fields and floodplains can play a really important buffer for downstream infrastructure. How to track that change over time is something that the research contractor is engaging in how to measure, model, or quantify those benefits. And we don't have an answer yet. It's even if it's still a challenge to try to get to that discrete method or protocol for quantifying it.
Do you have a question?
So for Andrew, I think for John in particular, you're mentioning that your watershed group has about 100 farmer members and there are a couple others in the state. Do you think that most farmers in the state are involved in one of those groups, or are there a lot that work independently?
I would have to assume there are a lot of them independent. Yeah, I mean, we're 100 farmers. We've got 580 dairy farms. We have 7,000 farmers in the state of Vermont, you know, from tiny farms on up. Many of those, obviously 7,000, are probably working off the farm as well. You know, it's just how they're classified. So, and these 3 watershed groups, you know, one's in Addison County, one's in Franklin County, which are the 2 most intense agricultural counties, along with Orleans, which is up in the northeast part of the state, and then Jennifer's group, that's the Connecticut River Valley, which is, you know, pretty fine, but the whole hilly part of Vermont, you know, is not very intense agriculture. You know, and there's a lot of farmers out there who are not represented. I mean, you know, and there are, you know, we have members of our organization who are members of Rural Vermont, or members of NOFA, the organic organization. There's a lot of cross membership. There's also Farm Bureau, and a lot of farmers are members of Farm Bureau for many different reasons. But the 3 watershed groups, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more involvement, and hopefully we can get that.
There was a question from Patty. Patty, I wonder if you want to unmute. I can mute you and ask your question.
Sure. Well, so, okay, what does stewardship imply for the farmers? How does that impact their land ownership? When you discuss with farmers, do you feel that ownership is an important theme? Does it influence their enrollment? Well, I mean, it's different. There's plenty of folks who don't own land, but are still farming. And so we use steward, you know, because it encompasses more people. It's not only farming, you know, for foresters or folks who are, you know, really concerned about natural resources. You know, it's a broader term, I suppose, and that you're really looking at more than just the, you know, economic product that you're making on your land. And as far as ownership, I mean, it's certainly important to some, but not all can afford it. And there are plenty of farmers who are leasing their land, and how it overlaps with CSP. You know, you can enroll in CSP if you lease the land. So any federal conservation programs, as long as you're the land manager, you can apply. Maybe there's some caveats there, but basically, if you either, you know, own the land or farm the land, you can be eligible for these programs. However, if your lease changes, that can be an issue. Since CSP is a 5-year program, you know, sometimes if you lose your lease sometime within that 5 years, it does impact your contract with the NRCS. So it can be an issue.
Can I just add to what Jennifer said? Because on the Climate Council, one of the things is mentioned amongst the hundreds of suggestions is a reassessment of land ownership and access. It's not really a reassessment of land ownership, but it's figuring out different ways to create access to land for people who want to farm, people, particularly diverse and less, trying to think the right way to phrase this, but people who haven't had the opportunity in the past for whatever reasons. And it's, there's a whole mass of different ways you can farm, not just renting, leasing, but share farming, which is different from share cropping. I'm thinking more of the New Zealand model, contract farming, where the ownership of resources is split between the operator of the farm and the owner of the land, and trying to make these systems work much better. And so we do have a proposal in the climate plan to look creatively at this whole issue of equity and land availability.
Just to provide, for federal programs, EQIP CSP, you have to have demonstrate control of the land over the way of that contract. And so if you're in an informal arrangement for a portion of what you're farming, it can be challenging to have all of your land enrolled. And so that is a consideration for any program development that involves federal programs, and that is beyond state NRCS to affect that. That's national contracting.
And just to add on from existing state programs where land ownership is an important aspect, there's the current use program. That is a huge incentive to keep agricultural land in production, but unfortunately, or the way that program is organized, it is a tax benefit to the landowners. So the idea to amend that program, particularly to enhance incentive, was sort of in the discussions for program development ruled out because farmers who lease land would not be captured. So we dropped discussions on that relatively early on.
I think we're just about out of time. It looks like there's one more question. So are there articulated goals or incentives for orchards, specifically regenerative or permaculture orchards, to spread biodiversity, introducing animals, not for the commercial sources, or generally be farms such as commercial or otherwise qualified for these various existing forests, and are PES being considered for those?
That's a good question. I would like to take first steps. This is something where we see the importance of having a diversified farmer seat on the PES working group. Betty Kempner, this is kind of her, she's always been raising the importance to include in any program development biodiversity incentives, and that would include hedgerows, that would include orchards, and everything that could fall within that category. And it's been so noticeable in the progressing of the meetings, how often it was her who would speak to that and bring it back on the table when there was any flicker and risk to lose it outside. And we are having an eye on it, and it's, looking at existing programs, we always, that is something that is really noticeable, that there's a lack of incentives in this realm, or that there's in theory opportunity to generate funding, but then it's something about programmatic rollout that is burdensome and effectively doesn't generate the funding streams necessary.
Can I add to that?
Then.
So, as far as the federal programs go and whether, commercial orchards, like you were saying, if they qualify for existing programs, yes, pretty much, any farm can qualify. What would I say? Okay, so organic farms do get some type of ranking benefit within the NRCS, so they get a couple extra points in the ranking process once the applications are being processed and ranked. So there is like a separate pot of money for organic. But they, you know, a commercial or conventional farm or orchard would still be able to qualify. There are, conservation programs that might be applicable to orchards, but not necessarily like what I'm seeing you say here. Not necessarily those types of what you would think of as permaculture standards, but certainly like contour planting, you know, irrigation to reduce water use. There are some programs that the NRCS pays for to replace, like to make the spray nozzle on, you know, when you're applying your pesticide to be more efficient. So there are like efficiencies, but they really are, you know, it's still for commercial or conventional use as well.
Thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you to all of those of you participating online. I'm going to ask the panelists who are here just to stay for a few minutes after so we can have some time to talk. And I would recommend that maybe step outside. I think you all have lunches with you too. So if you want to, if you don't have questions for the panelists, then you're welcome to go to your lunches. But yeah, we can also step outside if you choose. There's a nice porch that goes around this building. Okay, so thank you to everyone. Jennifer, I hope your daughter feels better soon. Sorry to miss you here, but thank you so much for your contributions. And
I'm sorry, I could.